I'm seeing our next speaker, fortunately, walk to the front of the podium. The reason I say fortunately is Steve is coming to us Boston via Philadelphia. Anybody who ever travels in and out of Boston and Philadelphia knows you never travel from Boston to Philadelphia to get to Cleveland. Steve learned that lesson this morning, and we're thrilled that he actually made it after a few flight change plans. Steve is the project manager of the Harvard Law School Digital Library, and he's been at Harvard for a number of years. He also contributed to building several thematic digital collections for Harvard's Open Collections project and served on technical teams that developed shared services for preserving, discovering, and delivering digitized library materials. Steve is here today to speak with us about advancing digital scholarship. Steve.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Part of the reason I enjoyed the invitation is that it definitely takes me out of my comfort zone. I'm not a scholar, I'm a practitioner. I work in a research library, the Harvard Law School Library. And I'm already thinking ahead to the big work of tomorrow afternoon with the breakout sessions between faculty and librarians here at Case Western, and trying to think ahead to put myself into your position to think about this colossal topic of scholarship and trying to outline some strategic directions. And it just seems so familiar to me. I mean, each of us within our individual campus and in a large university where I work, these conversations play out within an individual school of an individual campus. It just raises very, very large, and I think somewhat challenging prospects about identity and strategy. And I'm really glad that Laura mentioned John Unsworth's article, The Importance of Failure. There are a number of different zones in which we can work. So I think that a certain amount of infrastructure investment comes from the questions that we ask. And I was thinking of 5 different arenas or zones of work. And we have some of those discussions at my institution, and I certainly don't come here with any answers or any specific recommendations to your circumstances. But I think there are ways of looking at the larger landscape and the relationships among librarians and scholars to stake out what we can do best from our own local purviews. But before we talk about the strategic directions, I just wanted to acknowledge with the photographs that Kelvin Smith Library on the top and a drawing of Langdell Library where I work back at the Harvard Law School is that what I find so interesting when we look at projects that are online or think about large aggregations of data or follow the content really to the data that are being produced and where they are housed, I find it a bit ironic, but also I can understand why that we would be in libraries, create colloquia or symposia like this within a library, and find that from a really broad, simplistic way of looking at the world of data in this binary fashion, a lot of material isn't coming into the library. So what do we do as libraries? You know, as libraries, we have a collecting function, but we can also be facilitators, and we can also liaise. And so there's really, just in terms of the data, what I would just wanted to say is just to be permitted to just offer as a framing concept are 2 points. We have an absolute deluge of data, any kind of information in electronic form that's produced by and for scholars or to support pedagogy and scholarship. There's just an unbelievable quantity of data. And the data are being directed to organizations that really aren't libraries, and I think it's appropriate from within this context of the colloquium to think about what the library's role might be. So we have the traditional venues of scholarly output, which would be in publications and managed in repositories that are managed by publishers. We have repositories of various types, lots of institutional repositories. Established in the last 10 years on a given campus. And then we have stores, just thinking about data stores and other organizations and networks, and I'll try to provide a bit of a distinction between that. But again, talking about this from within a library, I want to be among, I want to be among the one of the librarians as a practitioner who sees myself as a person who works in digital libraries from a very large organization, and to acknowledge that we don't have much infrastructure. We don't have, if you follow the data and look at Harvard University, we don't have much of our scholarly output in the library. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's just an observation, and I think it's something important to reflect upon, especially now if we're coming into this late in the game in the libraries. I take seriously the question of what is it that we add to the enterprise from our traditional functions, or what we can do that's new. So with that, let me just start with what you'll see will be 5 different ways of strategizing this. They're not listed in any priority order, but it's a positioning framing, as you can see. And so to just bring it up at one starting point, those of us who identify ourselves as trying to be builders and maintainers of infrastructure for scholarly works, for scholarly publishing, or for scholarly communication, one venue or one arena of work is that we get in between the scholars and the publishers. And this is really familiar to me at Harvard University, where under the leadership of our former faculty director, Bob Darnton, I think one of the goals in raising this concern was to actually get an article in the New York Times, this is back in 2008, and to really bring this into the public sphere that there's a war going on, and that what Harvard was seeking to do was to distribute their scholarship online instead of signing exclusive agreements with scholarly journals that often have tiny readership and high subscription costs. So I feel that in the library, or among those folks who are used to managing data and got involved in this agenda, the agenda was not so much as managing scholarly heritage, but it was staking out an anti-position against the financial practices and control of information by publishers. And this is one of 2 big arenas of work, and it's going to be costly, it's going to be a big investment, it takes a lot of time and attention, and I think one way that, again, we can take a sort of simple look at our own institutions and our institutional values is to take another binary view here and to just ask ourselves on the basis of our faculties, what is our stand vis-a-vis the publishers? Are they friends or are they foes? And if you're getting into this arena of this scholarly communication, really becomes one of the weapons that you're using in the battle and the effort to create an open access domain. And so prior to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences vote at Harvard, they publicized this article as a means of advocacy, and Bob Darnton, again significantly, not just a university professor, but the head of the university library, and really seen by the world as such, was being a strong advocate to, quote unquote, free scholarship from the stranglehold of commercial publishers by making it freely available on our own university, from our own university repository. So what happened? Faculty of Arts and Sciences unanimously approved an open access repository and a commitment to retain their rights to publish. And I see, just from this screenshot of Harvard's Office for Scholarly Communication, 3 important components of infrastructure we created as a result of this and are maintaining now on our campus. The one was creating an office that wasn't there before. I think without a push for open access and the open access agenda, we wouldn't have an Office for Scholarly Communication. I mean, it really exists, and the infrastructure that was selected for this really exists to house preprints of articles. And it's the traditional model of thinking of scholarship from a variety of disciplines, humanities, social science, science, if our if one of our key products of work is getting something that goes into a peer-reviewed journal in that final preprint state or in the final state, it's absolutely incumbent upon us to have another place to put it. And there's a coordinating role, an advocacy role, and this is the purpose of the office, which is to perpetuate the values of open access, to ensure that faculty from a number of disciplines buy into this and create a compact which leads to one of the key products of this office, which are the open access policies. And it's easy, especially for somebody like me who works frequently in technology, to think about infrastructure as being comprised of hardware and software, but the other key parts, of course, are people and policies. And we have protocols for activity as well as protocols for data. So these open access policies needed to be seen as legitimate by Harvard and having faculty interest in mind. So not surprisingly, the draft policies were created by faculty at Harvard and vetted among them. And then finally, we have a repository for digital scholarship. And again, it's not just an open repository for any kind of content. It's the prescribed function in its origins was to facilitate the population of this repository with open access information, but then they later enlarged the scope to include those with some sort of coverage of rights by publishers prior to the establishment of this office. The model open access policy, this is just a link to the PDF that you can get from the previous site, has the rights retaining license and deposit requirement, and there's language, as noted here, that's informed by faculties at Harvard as well as MIT, Stanford, Duke, and others. So with the policy in place, the real front end, I think, of digital access to scholarship at Harvard is this page. And, you know, in fewer than 3 years' time, we've put, properly so, our repository infrastructure, a DSpace implementation of a way of just gathering some lightweight metadata about articles and bringing in article information into a repository where there's some search and browse functions, as you can see to your right on the panel. What I really see being promoted here, of course, is the reputation of the faculty. We're showcasing the faculty, and showcasing the faculty not only to provide some sort of incentives for them to deposit content to the open access repository, but I think tacitly acknowledging that a core function of these repositories and offices of communication, and a core component of success is to really contribute to the reputation building that faculty are looking for. And thinking about some of the outputs of these kinds of things, we get so input-centric about infrastructure and workflow to think, how do we capture and collect this information, that there's been comparatively little investment up until now about the outputs. So one key output would be statistics of use of this that are seen as legitimate. And that can all be done from within the confines of a single institution as Harvard. But if we're sitting here at another organization and thinking about open access repositories, I just grabbed a screenshot yesterday from this fun little mashup called repository66.org. And as of yesterday, Stuart Lewis here pulled in data from more than 2,100 repositories that are defined as open access. So there's ROR, the Registry of Open Access Repositories, and then there's the Directory of Open Access Repositories. And on the right, you see reference to some of the tools and back-end pieces of software that have been used to create these kinds of things. So DSpace, you know, co-developed by Hewlett-Packard and MIT. Naturally, there's lots of implementations of that, more than 800. bPress is a product that's marketed heavily to law schools and law school libraries out of Berkeley. Fedora is a type of architecture. So a couple of points about this slide. There's lots of different technologies that are available to be implemented and configured to create at least the repository function for what we would think of as open access articles. But if you're pushing for open access, it's not going to just be the article content itself. It's satisfying through some sort of metadata that we have rights information that we can document and report on that is open, that we have policies. And then the larger question here is I think one of federation and also one of investment. If there's more than 2,000 of these things worldwide, do we need another one? So if we're looking at campuses that haven't yet created these kinds of repositories, even if there might be formalized offices of scholarly communication, if you don't already have such an organization, and there is a push among faculty to really co-locate open access information, it really becomes a buy or build decision that I see with my middle manager's hat on here. And if we're thinking about the criteria by which we might evaluate these things in this landscape, we have an opportunity to piggyback. You know, do we want to put our content out of Case Western into one of these other things to avoid all of the time, energy, and expense of writing up our own code and hiring our own staff? I looked around. I mean, I didn't do a thorough search of this, but I just tried to scan the literature and talk to a couple of colleagues who work in this field every day to ask if anybody has come up with any kind of a vetted framework by which we can evaluate these things, and I haven't seen it. So just off the top of my head, I was thinking that if we look to these kinds of solutions and services that are out there as a fit to your institution's needs, what are the criteria that we should use? Just because they're there and they're built with DSpace doesn't mean that it's appropriate to the content that you have here and the needs that you have here. So if we're being co-opted into this war with publishers and the open access world, obviously we're going to look at the openness standards and policies and see if we're comfortable with those criteria. The showcasing function, I think, is really important. Again, not just as an incentive to contribute content, but also as one of the key outputs of this type of aggregation. You know, one of the benefits of the aggregation of data is to show that on the pecking order, you're more important than your colleagues, at least for right now. You're more cited, you're more quoted, whatever those metrics are in the field, and they might vary from discipline to discipline, you know, beg this development of algorithms. I mean, the technology really expresses the values that are there. What means of access are being provided? And I'm glad that Laura brought this up. You'll hear me mention this a couple of times, is I think we're moving away from pictures of infrastructure and discussions of digital scholarship and scholarly communications that are oriented towards content, with now more and more people openly saying that tools and services accompany the content, that this is the expression of scholarship, that with the tool there are different ways of interpreting something that used to be as ostensibly simple as a text. You know, it has a different context and a different presentation in the raw XML structured form versus the portable form on the ebook versus the other kinds of ways that things can be marked up and interpreted. So these levels of access become more critical, I think, over time to our assessment of the kinds of services that we are literally buying into if we're subscribers to any of these repository services or seeking to build our own. And I think this is where there's going to be a push to keep up with the scholarly community's needs. So the tools and services, access, it's all part and parcel, I think, with the content. And the expertise and community, I think, is an important thing. I'll have a screenshot later to, not to the Blake Archive, but to the Digital Scriptorium. You know, there's something that comes not with just your data being with other people in your field, but also you as an individual being able to participate in the development of the policies that govern this site and the investments that will be made in infrastructure. So you as an individual or your institution might want to be on the governing board of one of these repositories or archives because your agenda might be oriented more towards the humanities than the social sciences. You might have a particular set of needs, and so are certain organizations more amenable to your participation or not? What's the buy-in price for being in these kinds of communities? And how do we feel about the technical chops that are there among the people who are offering the service? Is there real expertise, or does it seem like that there's something a bit more fragile that's being supported? So that's where I wanted to start, because it's such a, I can see from my own parochial perspective at Harvard that so much has been invested in the last 10 years, in this first decade of really moving into the world of scholarship and trying to manage it from our campus. So much has been invested towards the whole open access agenda, which may not be important, and that's fine, but I just wanted to get that one out of the way. Another place that we can get involved in if we stay away from the relationships between scholars and publishers and respect those motivations and those outputs is to get between the scholars, the creators of content. Obviously, the scholars are both producers and consumers, so I'm thinking here of the scholars as producers, and the data stores. In other words, they're producing electronic stuff, and their stuff needs to go somewhere. Who's on our campuses whom we would entrust to evaluate these landscapes? Who knows the ecosystems that are out there of policies, systems, tools, and infrastructure? So I'm just bringing this slide back to our attention. This is just a picture of some of the institutional repositories that are worldwide. Well, there's an opportunity. You know, so what if I'm working regularly with scholars in the English department here at Case Western or from the medical school, and they have a lot of research data that they're creating, that their students are marking up texts, or that faculty in the medical school have grants, and there's real public health data from experiments in their labs. And they come to us legitimately as people whom they think in libraries presume to know something about knowledge management and data storage and preservation. Where does this stuff go? How do I know? This is becoming, I think, a difficult challenge to think about the skill sets that we need for people to be aware of the options that we have. And I'm being a librarian, I just want to classify them very generally into three different types of places. Institutional repositories, that would be a segregated entity within a single campus that's managing data that we would think of as usually open access data or preprint publishing. Something that's a little bit different in scope is when we look at some of these stores. Well, the Mellon Foundation put up the original monies for JSTOR, journal storage, ArtStore for works of art. These, in order to be a member of these organizations, you have to be a 501(c) organization. You can be a university or another nonprofit. But from my perspective, these are not libraries. They're neither libraries nor they're publishers, but they are huge entities that have a growing responsibility over certain types of content, particularly when we look to some of the other logos like this one of the digital scriptorium. There's content that really are almost entirely produced prospectively by scholars. You know, so we have a very active scholarly community that is producing these things. Well, why do we have multiples of these things? Why doesn't everything go into the Library of Congress? Why doesn't everything go into a commercial space like Google Books? I mean, it's not just the differences in the formatting and the nature of the content. Images and works of art are different from journals, but it's also, I think, in the policies that would govern these organizations and the communities that they're really trying to serve, and also the balance between preservation and access functions. Suffice it to say, a big component of infrastructure for these places is the storage and purported preservation promise that we have of putting things into these repositories. Something like ArtStore and the digital scriptorium, I think about when I hear of my colleagues talking to faculty. In some cases, it's less an interest of putting my material into the repository, but more of the benefit that I've heard about ArtStore, where if I did some field work on my trip to Italy last year and I took photographs of ruins, can I have tools from ArtStore where I can showcase my content that is still my own content with this other larger repository or library of images. So getting between these scholars and the data stores, I think it's again, whom do we have on staff who can really critique these places as organizations to see what they offering to us not only as opportunities to store, populate, and preserve big aggregations of scholarship, but also perhaps even separately to make use of tools that we feel are attractive for purposes of research or pedagogy. So I just dumped a few logos here from humanities and social science and the Hathi Trust. which originated as a repository of library copies of the books digitized by Google and some previous quote-unquote mass digitization initiatives. But again, from the previous speaker, we saw that this is morphing into other kinds of services that can be layered on top of that, like opportunities for research and research modules. So these are getting to be more complex entities, I think, to understand and for us to develop to marry up our needs with in thinking about our relationships and opportunities. Paul Ginsburg from Cornell, a physicist and looking at physics and mathematics. I mean, this goes back to 2001 about creating a global knowledge network. And, you know, an original vision that's there that I like, that I just wanted to acknowledge with this quote, is that researchers in looking at uses of technology, I think they're looking beyond just aggregating content, putting it into a repository, owning it on their own. I think that the idea has been around that we want to facilitate communities. This is pre-Web 2.0, but I think that we're now starting to see in some of these services an expression of this goal that people in our discipline can be pulled together by these aggregations and these stores of data to really facilitate collaborative research and communication. And so Archive, and the red logo there is for physics and mathematics, and Dataverse is social sciences, social science data sets, and Data One is Earth data, planetary and meteorological data. Medline, Astrophysics Data Service is more stuff. I'll just click on this link and hope this works. And again, to just get a feel for the network component here, where Data One is not just a data repository. I just love this right here, and you can follow this on your link on your own afterwards. I mean, there really is a community, and I just see the joy in these people's faces to really be identified with this, and these are words that are coming up more and more, I think, as components of a successful repository and successful infrastructure to aggregate and store things, which is that we have an innovative, that we're establishing the foundation of new innovative science through a distributed framework and sustainable cyber infrastructure. And there's more information that you can read about this, but this is, in essence, it boils down to, I think, much more than storage, as looking at data in some type of a managed network versus your own institutional repository. So one component of this, and this is where I spend a fair amount of my time if we think about this zone of getting in between scholars and the data centers, is are we going to be facilitators in the creation of this scholarship? And we, of course, representing myself, I'm thinking mainly of librarians, but really any of us as stakeholders in creating this from whichever department you come from. Is it our role to facilitate the creation? Now, you can do this by building and maintaining production centers that have gear and that have knowledgeable individuals. You can do it just through a commitment of funding and trying to, so last year a law school professor was interested in studying voting data, and he had copies of records from precincts, and I found a vendor that could transform all of these precinct records into encoded, well, it wasn't even encoded, it was just simple tabular data into Excel, which he could bring into statistical software to really look at patterns of probably discrimination. But in any event, we were able to offer this through the digital lab in which I work, not by hiring our own staff to actually encode things that originated in paper in order to help a professor and his colleague write an article. We just did it through having our own budget and finding a vendor that was qualified to do the work and managing that workflow. And there's a difference between a production center and an actual lab as a center for innovation, and these are starting to spring up. One just little note on the side, again, it can be a very big investment of infrastructure, is if we're getting into the creation discussion in the creation realm, are we going to look at the retrospective output of scholarship? I mean, this is significant too in terms of how much we have to capitalize by way of knowledge and hardware and software. So here's a screenshot of just a simple production center if people are doing audio and video production or just scanning some things. Is just a production house, and it's a fairly simple thing. University of Northern Iowa, Iowa State, they've had these at their universities for a while. This doesn't even have to be something within a library, but I just wanted to have two distinguishing pictures of what some of these production centers would look like to distinguish this, which is pretty basic and can fit into a room and pretty simple, versus this new meta lab at Harvard. And labs seem to be all the rage these days in terms of what's getting funded and cropping up at campuses. And so this is a research unit, again, dedicated to innovation and experimentation. And looking at research challenges in the bottom of the screen is that we have an open space for experimentation. Jeffrey Schnapp is a professor, humanities professor, came to Harvard from Stanford and works in the School of Design and other schools. But it's getting students together primarily to build portfolios of projects that are trying to expand the reach, impact, and public presence of the arts and humanities. This type of a catalyst and this type of an incubator is going to produce probably more code than content. And so if we think about outputs and what we're really investing in and trying to facilitate, again, just sort of a simple way of carrying some of these thoughts into your discussion tomorrow afternoon, labs and production centers are a bit different. Fostering innovation is a lot different from helping students create papers. Helping people create code is different from helping them create content. At some point, though, part of this infrastructure just boils down to being a liaison and facilitating some movement of data from the scholar or the scholarly community to one of these kinds of data centers. And so this means that we need to build or tie into existing infrastructures that are already there outside of Case Western, where we could provide that liaising function, in part by assessing or auditing these repositories. We have the luxury of lots of choices now. There's lots of external services that are available. We don't have to build all of our own to try to facilitate collecting these kinds of things and fostering tools. But if there are so many that are external, by what criteria do we find the ones that work best for us? It's a big question. There's the production aspect, and something that I think is going to be appearing in more organizations, particularly from within the university archives, when we think about records of the institution, such as email, is just this job of wrangling the data. Yes, and I know data are moving to the cloud. They're being more distributed. We don't necessarily carry all of our data with us and keep it with us from the beginning to the end of our career. Makes it all the more difficult then to associate content or work with a particular scholar, and then to face yourself with the prospect of pulling that together to get it into the appropriate place where there's the benefit of association with a given community, where there's the opportunity to have it parsed by particular tools, where there's aggregation, where there's additional markup. There's lots of incentives, I think, for us to put data maybe into several repositories. Maybe they don't go into one. Maybe they go into several places to be marked up. It's somebody's job to pull this stuff together and at an initial point to do some forensics. If we have data files, are they virus-free? Are they in the formats that they purport to be? Do they have the appropriate metadata to associate them with the rights holder? Are they appropriately structured and understood? And just getting things into, all of that requires some sort of machine interpretability so a human being can make that judgment. And so this is a really significant investment of software that can really read and interpret these byte streams, which is all they are to these machines, in order for us to understand them as content. The longer things stick around when they're outside of a managed organization, the more we're going to have to invest just in this inquiry of what kind of data do we have? What do we think is here? Before we even shuttle it forward. This is a great opportunity, I think, for a collaborative function. I mean, it's going to be crazy if each of us in our own institutions makes the investment to do this locally. It just doesn't make sense. And after the forensics, I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts. I love that phrase. I don't know where it came from. Willing to bet that when we look at this last point of our target repository, those policies are going to inform whether we leave our data in its native state or almost certainly convert it. We are going to convert it, or we're going to augment it with more metadata in order to take advantage of the benefits that would be offered to us by a repository. So one typical thing that you'll encounter is that certain formats have a preservation commitment where the storage entity is not only responsible to take in the information, but they will make a commitment to be able to render it to our devices so it's human readable over time. That's distinct from just having an organization take in my data and provide quote unquote bit preservation. You know, we will take in your files, we'll give you back your files at any point in the future, but it's your responsibility, scholarly community, to be able to interpret it, not ours. So that's a big incentive then for us as the intermediaries, as the data wranglers, to transform, normalize, enhance data in order to get those benefits. Again, who's going to do that? Is that work that is best done in a shared and a collaborative fashion, or does it get distributed? So that's strategy question 2 is one of my 2 big ones in terms of food for thought for you tomorrow afternoon and after that. You know, just positioning yourself between the scholars as producers and the data stores, I think, raises a number of those questions. Some of them are evaluative, some of them are financial, but I think it's fair enough game in a strategy session to consider these things. I was really impressed in just poking around on the web that in this arena between scholars and funders, you know, money matters in terms of where the scholarship is coming from, that our folks at our colleagues and friends over there at the University of California, at the California Digital Library, they have a curation center where they've come up with this really simple data management plan tool. And in their DMP tool, you know, what they're acknowledging is that institutions, what they're acknowledging is that there's a select number of funders, and when scholars are going to the National Science Foundation, as we might hear later, and to the National Endowment for the Humanities and other funders, data management plan is a requirement, quid pro quo, to get funding. And this is good. This produces some discipline among our community. Data have to go somewhere where they're going to be managed. And the way that the folks at the California Digital Library set this stuff up is that they're inviting us. You know, Harvard's not on this list yet. Case Western's not on this list. We can be a contributing institution where we can leverage this investment of coming up with data management plans to really help all of us, you know, produce excellent grant applications and to be in compliance and conformance with what the funders are requesting. So there might be other types of initiatives that you could find or identify, or for all I know, you've started to create them here, that really facilitate compliance and conformance with funders and make you more competitive in that arena. It's, again, another zone or another place to think about infrastructure, particularly if your infrastructure is one of advice and facilitation of best practice in something as critical as fundraising. All right, so this is a bit of an aside, which could raise a couple of good questions, so I'll just go through it in just a few minutes here. But this is just another way of thinking about getting between the scholars as producers and the data store, and that's to really beg the question of the library. And this is one of the things that I find myself working on with our team a lot. And when we think about scholarship and the library and why we don't have as much coming into our library as we should, it's really leading us to spend quite a bit of time focusing on our collection development policy. And when we really think about acquisition, what I like about scholarship and this deluge of data and all of this great investment that our academic communities are making in creating tools and all of the excitement around it, I think it does provide a mirror and an opportunity for us to reflect on our collecting mission in a library. And why is it that certain scholarly products aren't coming into our domain? There's a lot of domains, there's a lot of disciplines. Do we have the appropriate expertise? Do we have the appropriate people with knowledge on staff, the right systems, services, and policies to acquire something like journal articles and preprints? I think one of the reasons that we created a separate repository to scholarship at Harvard rather than leveraging a preservation repository we already made is that the technology providers that we were talking to at Harvard said, we don't have a service to index articles and provide article level search and discovery. And that was an acceptable answer at the time, that being in the library, our data structures and our discovery framework was largely developed off of MARC. We have significant investments not only in the commercial relationship with Ex Libris to describe and facilitate access to our library holdings through that one system and that one service, but that's a lot of the staff that we have hired. And so when you have other data structures that don't play nice in that world, you could see where the organization's posture is one of resistance rather than embracing this kind of stuff. So what I want to think about is our collection policy out of whack with our infrastructure or vice versa? Why is it that libraries may or may not be seen as venues for this kind of stuff? Perhaps it's too few librarians that are really getting involved and trying to push the capabilities of the library to fit these other new types of scholarship. Beyond the acquisition and collection development function, we have the preservation mission. I think that we've achieved credibility, at least among ARL libraries and national libraries, as being able to be sustainable repositories of knowledge. There's definitely blemishes on our record that, Nicholson Baker and others have called us out on, whether he's pointing fingers at the New York Public Library or the British Library. But by and large, these kinds of organizations, universities, tend to last for decades over time. National libraries tend to as well. So if we think about the preservation function as an essential component of the management and distribution of scholarship, over the long run, can we afford to have this kind of critical content not be managed by libraries and library entities? I'm not sure, but it's going to take a lot more coordination than we've achieved so far to become credible repositories to just fulfill a preservation function. And if we're not doing it and we're looking to other kinds of external entities like the Hati Trust, then we have an opportunity from a local domain to provide an auditing function and to look at things like the trustworthy repository auditing and certification framework that Hati has elected to subscribe to that, and we could read those reports and through that kind of transparency, perhaps as librarians, sanction their capability. We have description and management access, and then the last part, are we partners with our scholars? Are we really seen as being active servants and partners, servants to and partners with our own scholarly communities? That's kind of our legitimacy, and if we elect not to do that in the libraries, then we go back to the first slide where the future is that the librarians are less collectors and more traffic cops and data wranglers and analysts, and help facilitate getting things into these other kinds of entities. And so that brings us to the last and probably most active and most expensive arena of strategy and involvement, as I see it, for infrastructure. Let's just take it for granted that we have electronic scholarship of all kinds of formats and of all kinds of use patterns, of a broad range of quality, and in a highly distributed storage arena. That's where the stuff lives, and the users are walking around with different devices every day with greater and greater demands. And what use, of course, is it to have this stuff if it's not useful? And getting in this arena is absolutely key, and this is the place, of course, at the front end of it all, that those of us who purport to be building and maintaining infrastructure are going to be criticized most heavily or scrutinized most heavily, which is at the front end of this service. When I'm going to access my information, are you giving me a credible service that I can use this? People's most important, what I've found 15 years ago when I was an intern at Cornell, all the way up until now, regardless of how many times I had the privilege of talking to faculty or trying to provide services, the one thing that I learned right away is that time is a precious commodity to everybody. It doesn't matter what your role is or where you are, and so we have to have responsive applications, we have to be time sensitive, and so Zotero, you guys might have heard of this or seen it, the representatives talking about this tool as a wonderful, convenient tool to aggregate scholarship from a lot of the repositories whose logos I showed you earlier, and to be able to pull them together in a web domain and use them in an active way. Scott F. Johnson, he's a classic scholar. I have a reference on the last slide to where this quote is from his dyspeptic blog post. I love reading people who are on a rant, the passion that is there and the emotion is there, and the legitimate criticism is that in terms of integrating this scholarly information with the way researchers want to interact with it, this is absolutely key. It's just the key challenge, and I think that in the battles that are being fought, for all of the time and energy that we might be spending and expending for the very, very worthwhile cause of open access, particularly as that enables us to regain some control over library budgets for other functions. I mean, we have a big self-interest in the open push for open access. There's this other arena too, and this other arena is not just to ensure that things are openly available, but to be able to make sure that there's credible involvement in understanding the needs of scholars and helping to develop tools that meet those interests. And I just have screenshots, again, of some very, very big initiatives where we as citizens of these nations have a stake in this. But what I like about the organization of this service, where we have the word data in it, data.gov, this is out of the US, is that metrics, apps, data, they're all next to each other. I like the fact that apps are right next to data, just underscoring this point that you can't have one without the other, and that the real usefulness of the data depends not only upon its preservation, its aggregation, its searchability, its openness, but the apps that go with it. And we see the same thing across the pond in the UK, same thing, data, apps, ideas, that there's a real community. This kind of an infrastructure and this kind of a development really means that people are making it their strategic priority to pay attention to developing these tools and to be able to facilitate linking and aggregation on a large scale. Speaking of Europe and the US, in addition to these government initiatives to aggregate data and make it open, there's Europeana, which is a library, a consortium of libraries in Europe, and now the Digital Public Library of America that has grants, generous grants from the Sloan Foundation and Arcadia to develop an infrastructure, are both working very, very much in this arena of linked data. This is perhaps in addition to core preservation standards, the one standard that I would cite as doing things on a large scale and really trying to facilitate aggregating things and making it useful so that we bring the right type of data together to avail the data of the kinds of tools that people want to be making on our own campuses, and then thinking about how those applications can be put back into repositories, and just managing this world of the explosion of information and thinking about how do we know what we have and where it is. These linked data standard and the structures that are underlying this seem to be getting a fair amount of attention out of these data stores to re-express our contents and to facilitate this kind of content distribution and aggregation. The Surf Foundation is out of the Netherlands, and like this Clifford Lynch from CNI was talking about surf recently, and I always sort of pay attention to what he's talking about, but this is a top-down initiative out of the Netherlands, again, to think about aggregating content and to really satisfy the needs of scholars and students. And from this infrastructure slide, and there's links to all of this when the presentation is online, I like this laundry list of what infrastructure, what some key components of infrastructure are when you really are service-oriented in your framework. Repositories are a given, but then we need some sort of persistence of identifiers, and there's standards around that, the appropriate types of metadata and interoperability among all these metadata ontologies, definitions of complex objects where you have a standard article and all of the underlying research data and footnotes that might support it, tools and widgets that accompany this, statistics. This is a big, impressive list. I mean, I'm daunted by thinking of getting into this game and wanting to do it in a way that we can succeed, it's really important to associate our strategies with our resources and vice versa. And what they are also acknowledging is their commitment to really contribute their staff and expertise and tools and outputs out of SURF to really contribute to what they're trying to create as a European knowledge infrastructure, and to have that be open and something that we can build upon. So, in terms of the tools that we might be thinking about locally within each of our own universities, the first one, I am really humbled by that. You know, what are the right kinds of skill sets that we need in our organization? Are these anthropological? Are they information science based? But knowing scholars and their needs and being able to translate those needs into requirements that people who write code can understand is a really important function and skill set. You're not going to have the kinds of tools that our community demand without the appropriate requirements and without somebody really understanding the interests of scholarship and the capabilities of technology. And the you know, one of the interesting things that we're seeing happening in our organizations as we reorganize and think about not only what's happening in libraries such as ours, but in schools of information science is having people moving away not only from creating metadata, but also more actively having people on staff whose job descriptions look like this, particularly if you have a data archive that you're managing. Where, you know, we have a data and services developer. This is just something that came up yesterday. And it's a UK data archive providing support for critical needs, integration and testing, legacy applications, new processes, new tools, new architectures. If we don't have these kinds of people locally, then these are the kinds of partners that we might want to go to. So I could put a dozen job descriptions in here that just make the point that in moving us strategically in libraries to get closer to these kinds of services that support scholars, we better have people who understand that intersection of content, metadata, tools and services, and ultimately code as a way of satisfying our user needs. So what I encourage you to do tomorrow, those of you who are sitting down tomorrow afternoon to think about this, is to look outward in strategizing your local priorities. And look outward and thinking about what expertise, partnerships, pathways, and services are already there that you can join, or where are those places that you want to augment those kinds of things in a unique way that really expresses your needs and interests here. And the venues that we can think of, again, in summary, are these kinds of positions that we can take. Not soapbox grandstanding positions, just venues for us to make our investments and to make the locus of our work as we see ourselves as people who facilitate scholarship. We can be between them and the publishers, between the scholars and the funders, between the scholars and the data stores. We can revisit our own collection management policy and our own infrastructure to think, why shouldn't libraries be places that compete in this arena? And there might be other arenas that come to your mind as well. Our staff roles in libraries are, I'll start at the bottom. You know, we can continue to be traditional collectors and librarians and being much more outward facing in looking to electronic content, and not just content, but code and tools and the kinds of things that are being created in labs and classrooms every day now, and try to find out a way that we bring those into our domain and challenge ourselves. Or we can be outward facing to some of those other organizations I referred to, and our roles become ones of advocacy and analysis and assessment and maybe data wrangling, depositing, and tools developer. And here's some of the links to those sources that we saw earlier. And I haven't left too much time for questions, but I'd welcome questions now and discussion during the break. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it. Question? Yes, please.
In the sense of people go to it from outside.
Yeah,
I
so
actually tried to get there, and
yeah.
just before your coming this morning,
Yeah.
I didn't find Google Scholar or many places sending you there.
Sending you there, I know.
Get there.
Yeah.
Doesn't it actually work that?
Yeah, it works. I mean, but you know, you have to go to that own portal to do its own searching of metadata. There hasn't been a big investment. The two big agenda items for Dash so far have been to to try to get more Harvard faculties to accept the compact, the open access policy. So it started with the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and law has signed off on it, and the medical school. And then the second thing is to try to quantify how many faculty have contributed and how many articles have come in. But I think you're...
That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is, do I ever go there?
Right.
The answer is no.
Exactly, and I'm going to bring that back. I'm going to bring that back home. So what I tried to do is to answer your first question is, what metrics are the people who created Dash using to define whether it's successful or not? And clearly, one of the things that they're not looking for to define its own success is used by people externally. It has a very parochial feel to it. And you know, I know the manager of Dash, and I'll talk to her about it, and I'll bring this feedback back to her and ask what's up. But they haven't invested much at all in trying to have the content that's in Dash be recognized by other entities, and to try to have those kinds of mashups through the correct protocols that you could pull data out of our domain and have it go into other places. They haven't, as you've rightly discovered. They haven't made that kind of investment to make that data, which are there in not very significant quantity, best exposed and best used. Other questions? Feel free to throw more stones at Harvard. I can take it. It's fine. Yes, in the back. My position is just in the law school library. We have a School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and certainly all of the faculty in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences are all part of this digital access to scholarship community, and all of the faculties, including CES, School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, are now putting content into that kind of a service. But it's such a small component of what we're creating in the institution. I'm not aware of the libraries right now where I work actively trying to partner with people in the classroom and in the research labs out of engineering to really capitalize on the content that they're making, or to have some sort of a joint engineering initiative in terms of the kinds of systems and system architectures we're creating. I'm not aware of that happening out of the School of Engineering at Harvard. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there's faculty in the School of Engineering that are building a wonderful architecture that they're implementing at another university this afternoon. That certainly happened at Cornell with Fedora, that they had computer scientists who developed an architecture that Cornell initially said no thank you, and other organizations took that up. Yes, please.
Your experience with challenges of preserving
The challenges of preserving? Yeah, so on the preservation side, my experience in working with folks who created a preservation repository has been that when I used to be part of that group, and the Library of Congress did this too, as early members of the Digital Library Federation a number of years ago, we tended to express preservation services according to formats. And as a result, it turns out that you can look at data. So the preservation work that has the greatest level of attention and redundancy of storage and professional management and lots of metadata and Oracle databases, and would really hold up well to this trustworthy repository auditing and certification framework as a legitimate, trustworthy place to put information. The information that's there has to be library-like. It's either library-owned or library-sponsored, and it has to conform to certain format requirements. Therefore, there's a pipe, and lots of things that meet those requirements are getting into that pipe. But what I'm seeing at a lot of the big name institutions is that these preservation repositories that they've built, particularly within the libraries and managed, primarily are storehouses of digitized content. And those are valuable assets and raw materials, and they can be improved upon greatly, as we heard from our first speaker, from Laura, from all of the markup that we can apply later. But that's kind of it. It's a lot of digitized text, a lot of digitized images, some recorded sound, not moving images, not complex multimedia objects, not performance-based material. We have a lot of research to do, I think, to really increase the scope of what we can bring in, and not just store, but really say that we have a commitment to ensure that it remains renderable over time. Is that your sense as well? That we don't have a lot going on? Yeah, the infrastructure's there. It just needs, somebody needs to figure out how to make it scale and how to make it more responsive to the kinds of content that our communities are creating. We're doing more than just turning pages into encoded text. Well, I guess we have a break now. I'll turn it back over to Arnold, and I'll be around with the other speakers and look forward to talking to you more. Thanks again.